Back in the before times, horror gaming was a little bit different than it is today. In movies, you had your gore fests, your slashers, your alien invasions, and a handful of slow burn, mystery driven hauntings like The Exorcist or Poltergeist. In video games, they followed the louder, bloodier model. Horror was an aesthetic, not really a genre. In the 80s, if you saw a horror license on a game box, odds are you weren't getting scares, you were getting an action game wearing a scary mask, or something from LJN. Probably something from LJN. Which, to be fair, could be pretty terrifying for completely different reasons. Take Friday the 13th for the NES back in '89. People remember it for being confusing and weird. You wander between cabins, throw rocks at zombies, and occasionally box Jason in his questionable purple and teal outfit. Creepy in theory, but not exactly survival horror. Except the alarm sound when a counselor is getting attacked. That kind of still haunts me in my dreams right alongside the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles underwater section. And then there's Nightmare on Elm Street back in the 90s, which let you and up to 3 friends punch and kick your way through Freddy's dream world. Again, though, fun as a brawler, but it's not trying to terrify you. Over on home computers, you had the likes of Uninvited and Shadowgate. First person static screen adventures with puzzle solving and the occasional gruesome death screen. Very atmospheric, but not really that scary. You really had to let your imagination do the work. And then, of course, there were the oddities like Splatterhouse, gory and loud and full of chainsaw wielding monsters, but at the end of the day, still a side scrolling beat 'em up. Even Japan's console horror at the time was mostly the same line: fast, flashy, and more about reflexes than dread. The common thread across all of them was that horror was treated as a set dressing. The monsters were there, but the tension, the fear, none of that stress was really available. That's why it's so remarkable that before Alone in the Dark or Clock Tower or Resident Evil, there which is why it's so remarkable that before Alone in the Dark and Clock Tower and Resident Evil, there actually was a survival horror game that existed. It really slowed things down and made the player more vulnerable than a continue screen 20 minutes in, and really worked to set the tone and pacing for actual terror, as much as it could muster anyways for the Famicom. It's probably one of the most important games in video game history, right up there with Mario. You might have heard of it in Kotaku or an IGN article, but the chances are you've never really seen it and you've definitely never played it. This game is sweet home for the Famicom. And before we continue, if you enjoy RPG and horror game deep dives, playthroughs, stuff like that, go ahead and give me a subscription if you so feel inclined. I do stuff like this all the time, and the channel has tons of content already, and plenty more to come. In 1989, Japan saw the release of Sweet Home, a horror film about a documentary crew exploring an abandoned mansion of a long dead painter. Inside, they find the place haunted by the vengeful spirit of the painter's wife, still mourning the tragic death of her child. From there, it's pretty much just a bloodbath. Crew members picked off one by one in brutal but creative ways. It's very much a product of the late 80s horror. Lots of gore, mystery, and no guarantee anyone makes it out alive. If you want, you can actually watch it for free on YouTube. The game that followed took the same setting and backstory, but left the slasher sensibilities behind. What Capcom made was a slower and more methodical approach, built around the players solving the mystery for themselves, packaged in a JRPG, almost Dragon Quest esque cloth. Sweet Home starts out by dropping you straight into the action. You play as a group of 5 documentary filmmakers entering the abandoned Mamiya mansion. They are there to recover a collection of priceless paintings left behind by the legendary artist. The place is famous not just for its art, but the tragedy surrounding it. Overcome with grief, she spiraled into madness, and the mansion became her tomb, along with anyone unlucky enough to visit afterwards. That's pretty much the backstory you walk into: a rotting mansion filled with locked doors, hidden rooms, and the lingering spirit of a woman who refuses to move on. This isn't a run from the monster until the credits roll or a fight zombies on a side scrolling map type thing. This is a full on RPG. Your job is, much like in modern horror, to figure out why the mansion is haunted and escape, as opposed to the movie where everyone just kind of died. The game gives you 5 playable characters, each with their own permanent irreplaceable tool, which is pretty much their role in the group. Nurse with a medical kit, and the only really reliable way to heal your status effects. Kazuo is the leader, carrying a lighter for burning ropes and clearing out obstacles. Taro, a photographer with a camera used to capture murals and clues painted on the walls. Asuka, a cleaner with a vacuum, perfect for removing glass shards and debris. and Emmy, a locksmith with a key essential for opening certain locked doors. The place where the game first deviates from standard JRPG practices is permadeath. If a character dies, they're gone for the rest of the run. That's it. But the game softens the blow just enough to keep you moving forward, because scattered throughout the mansion are single use substitutes for each character's core tool. For instance, if you lose Taro, you can still find disposable cameras to keep progressing, but those backups are limited. Eventually, too many characters die, you will run out of ways to solve certain puzzles, between inventory space and not having the correct tools because items are limited. You're also able to split your party up into smaller teams, which increases the threat level of enemies but is required for many puzzles and rooms. Sending off Asuka and Emi could leave Emi frozen or petrified from an enemy, and now you have to figure out how to get Akiko with her medical kit caught up to them to heal it. But maybe there's a button you needed to press to get Akiko into the room, which is why you split the party in the first place, which means first you have to backtrack with Asuka to press the button, which presents its own threats. On top of that, each character can only carry 2 additional items beyond their signature tool. This includes key items. This forces constant decisions. Do you bring a weapon for safety or some sort of essential puzzle item that you found that might be needed deeper in? Every trip into a new part of the mansion becomes a miniature expedition, and the wrong choice can mean disaster or worse, another permanent loss. It's a constant balancing act between exploration, efficiency, and survival. And if you love survival horror, this is going to all sound very familiar. One thing you don't expect from an 80s Famicom RPG is a jump scare, but Sweet Home actually has some. For instance, at certain points of the game, it will suddenly cut to a battle screen, but instead of fighting a monster, you'll see a chandelier shaking ready to fall, and you'll get to choose between dodging left or right. It certainly feels urgent, like a quick time event before those even existed, but as far as I could tell, failing never actually killed me. Still, the first time it happens, and many times after that until you start to test it, it feels like you could lose a character right then and there, and you'll panic some. Most of the other environmental hazards work differently. Your characters can slip into holes and become stranded, forcing another party member to come to rescue them with a board. Or if you run out of wooden planks to cross gaps, you can end up with a character permanently stuck on the wrong side. These situations aren't super flashy, but they are devastating if unprepared. I personally almost had a moment where I fell into a hole and my character was hanging on by the edge, and I was like, I have to help them, but I had no plank, so I had to go find another plank. And if I remember right, there was like panic music playing, and it was a lot for a Famicom game. Though I would never really call them dated, people work really hard in the modern era to make their games look like this pixel artwork. But the fact that they can make you panic a little bit is kind of incredible considering what it is. Sweet Home's Mansion isn't really a place you can just wander through at your leisure. Very similarly to Shadowgate, which I would basically say is like its cousin, you'll constantly run into blocked doors and locked passages and impassable hazards. The only way forward is to find the exact item needed to bypass them. You see that in a lot of modern games too. You see an obstacle, make a mental note, and keep exploring until you stumble onto the solution. Think the heart key from Resident Evil 2. Do you need to get through a locked door? Find the key. Do you need to cross a gap? You better have some planks in your inventory. There's even a progression tied to character specific tools like Taro's camera to reveal clues or Asuka's vacuum to clean up debris. Or like Asuka's vacuum to clear debris or perhaps clean off a fresco so that you can take a picture of it and get the hint that you need. Because items are scattered all over the mansion, there's a constant rhythm of discover the obstacle, search elsewhere, find an item, double back. It's slow and deliberate, and a huge part of why Sweet Home kind of feels more like an interactive haunted house than a typical Famicom horror game. Unlike modern games, there's not really an in game checklist or waypoint or even a map. You're relying entirely on memory, notes, and sheer stubbornness to push forward. At least in the 80s and 90s. You can totally just look up a guide now. I sure as hell did. It's easy to forget where that locked door, blocked staircase even was, especially with a total lack of a map. Plus, I'm terrible about not taking notes. Sweet Home's permadeath system isn't just a little novelty thing. It actually brings with it a lot of tension because it is required to get the good ending of the game to have every character survive. Of course, you might not have known that in the 80s, assuming you could read Japanese and play the game, but I know I had to do several resets so I wouldn't have to replay the entire game for the good ending. Not to mention, if a character dies, you lose their tools, meaning you're now relegated to having to find the one-time use versions of those tools. And not only have you lost two inventory slots from that person dying, but now you're losing a third inventory slot to carrying around their version of that tool. The backups are also finite, meaning you can theoretically get soft locked. The game's multiple endings are determined by how many party members survive to escape the mansion. Save everyone, and you get the best ending and some closure. If you lose some, the survivors limp away. If you lose too many, and you probably won't even kill the final boss. Now, I'll admit, when I stream the game, I save scum my way through it. You can save anywhere, and with stakes this high, it's kind of encouraged. Combine that with the item gated structure, and you get a constant low level anxiety while playing. Every trip into an unfamiliar hallway is a gamble. Will you find the key item you need, or will you just stumble into a bad fight and lose someone essential? That constant risk reward loop is a foundation of survival horror gaming, and this game basically invented it. And this is where the DNA of Resident Evil starts to peek through. When Capcom greenlit the horror game that became Resident Evil, it was originally envisioned as a remake of Sweet Home. Takuro Fujiwara, which is the creator of Sweet Home, asked Shinji Mikami in 1993 to remake the game, but for new hardware. As development evolved, it turned into what we would come to know as Resident Evil or Biohazard. Even after moving away from an official remake due to licensing limits, the DNA of Sweet Home remained deeply embedded in Resident Evil. Several core elements carried over directly, like the Haunted Mansion setting, the inventory management with limited space, those door loading screens that really build tension, puzzles that are tied to unique characters and tools like Jill's lockpick. There's the scattered nodes and environmental storytelling, multiple endings based on who survives, and a landscape of backtracking and layered exploration. Once you've played Sweet Home, you really can't unsee it when you play Resident Evil again. The lighter puzzles and the tension of limited resources, the oppressive scanning of each room, and those mechanics all come from Fujiwara's Famicom game. Even later entries like Resident Evil Zero reuse the idea of character specific tools and swapping for exploration. Resident Evil is basically responsible for the survival horror genre. Sure, you could probably say Clock Tower, but at the end of the day, the average person, if you ask them, they're gonna say Resident Evil. The fixed camera angles and the tight inventory limits and resource scarcity as a form of tension, environments that felt like real interconnected spaces instead of isolated levels, that figure it out or dial design and philosophy, it all became the DNA of survival horror. And yet, really, nobody knows this. If you've ever played Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, or The Evil Within, you've been living in a world that Sweet Home built. Most players will never know. They've been walking into the shadows for decades and never knowing their roots. Except for you. Now you know. And you know what's really funny? The entire Resident Evil series started with the Haunted Mansion, not zombies or viruses, but a literal ghost story. That was the core format for Sweet Home. And I can't help but see its shadows even decades later in Resident Evil 7. Eveline isn't a ghost in the literal sense, but she fills that same role as Lady Mamiya. The tragic central figure haunting a home, warping the lives of everyone inside and driving the entire plot. The mansion might be in Louisiana this time, but the beats are very familiar. A family torn apart, a creeping dread of unseen presence, and that mix of pity and fear. I see Resident Evil 7 as sort of a extension or maybe even a true spiritual successor to Sweet Home. There's no confirmation from Capcom that this is the case, but given the parallels, I would say even if it's not intentional, there's something in there that carried over. Sweet Home is more than just a footnote in Capcom's history. It's sort of the thing that got them where they are, whether or not they still know that. It's where the whole Haunted Mansion came from, and where the puzzles and the item loops come from, and where the idea that every step you take could make you stronger or lock you out of the game entirely. And yet, most people have never even heard of it, let alone played it. That's the real tragedy here. Sweet Home isn't on the Switch Online and it's never had a remaster. It's not on Steam or any modern consoles. Unless you track down an original Famicom copy and speak Japanese and have the hardware to run it, it's gone. And that's both why conversations like this matter, as well as something like the Stop Killing Games movement matter, so that we aren't basically throwing the Mona Lisa in the sewers. So now you know. You know about that little 8-bit game that spawned a franchise juggernaut and maybe even shaped the modern horror genre. And the next time you're going through Resident Evil and you're one bad choice away from losing everything, just remember, it all started here. So, of course, now I'd like to hear from you. Had you heard of Sweet Home before today? Do you think that they should revive it? Have you played it? Let me know in the comments below and be sure to subscribe so that you can join me on my next trip through